Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Counterpoint podcast. Today, I have a super interesting topic lined up where we're going to be talking about the rapidly changing dynamics of the smartphone market. And we're going to be talking about original equipment manufacturers, or what we call for short OEMs, globally, and also what they're doing in different regions. Now, a lot has changed over the last couple of years, especially with Huawei sanctions happening, LG's exit from the smartphone market, the COVID lockdowns that we're seeing, and also these global component shortages, which have really been impacting the market. And there's so much more here as well. Now, as a result, what we're seeing in the market is that the top smartphone vendors are changing rapidly in terms of rankings, who's number one, who's number two, who's number three. And this is especially also across different regions. And different manufacturers are gaining in some, while others are losing ground in others. So to talk about this, I actually have two colleagues on this podcast with me today, Harmeet Singhwalia and Aman Chaudhry. Welcome, guys. How's it going?
Hey Maurice, good to be back.
Very well, Morris. Thank you for having me at the podcast.
Excellent. Let's get right into it. And like I said before, we'll start off on the global level and then we'll drill down into different regions. Now, starting off on the global level, Samsung has been the top smartphone vendor globally for the past few years now, but in April 2020, Huawei briefly surpassed Samsung to become the top smartphone maker. And again, in June 2021, we've seen Xiaomi actually become the top smartphone vendor globally. Now, what can you tell me about this rapidly changing environment of the number one spots being taken over by some OEMs?
That's a very interesting question, Maurice. So if you see, Samsung has indeed been the top smartphone vendor globally for the past few years, but that is on an annual basis. There's quarterly analysis of the top players. One sees that the results are not necessarily as uniform as one may expect. So there are certain quarters which are definitely strong for Samsung, but not necessarily all. For example, in quarter fours, with bulk of the impact of Apple's iPhone launches being felt in that quarter, Apple, in most of the recent quarters, in fact, if we see between 2015 and 2020, in 4 of those 6 quarter fours, Apple has been number one smartphone OEM globally, and Samsung has been number two. And as you mentioned, in April 2020, and in fact, Q2 2020 entirely, what we saw was Huawei coming on top. And we've seen again this year, briefly in June, where Xiaomi took over as the number one OEM. But one has to see why this normally happens. One, yes, there are certain quarters which are where certain OEMs perform better than others. But one also has to see what's happening with Samsung in this quarter. While Xiaomi's growth is definitely not accidental, its rise to the absolute top at the end of quarter 2 2020 was also definitely a result of the production difficulties that Samsung faced with its factory in Vietnam being temporarily non-operational due to COVID-induced lockdowns. This is also in a quarter when Samsung historically is seen as being slightly relatively weaker. Its shipment share, for that matter, is actually a little bit lower. For example, in quarter ones, which is when Samsung has its flagship launches and therefore its strong quarter. In quarter one, you'd see Samsung's shipment share being well over 20%, sometimes up to 24-25% of all shipments coming from Samsung. But in quarter two, it usually is just above or just below 20%, sometimes going as low as 18%. And so in that quarter, for Xiaomi to take over as the number one OEM towards the end of that quarter does not necessarily mean that OEM dynamics are going to permanently change. What that does mean, however, is that Xiaomi is doing better, which is on the back of Huawei's exit from the market, as you mentioned, with the sanctions. And that is also because Xiaomi has been clever enough with its channel strategy. It has a strong online presence, which definitely also helped Xiaomi in regions where we saw COVID-induced lockdowns and people gravitated towards online shopping. So will this be a permanent push towards Xiaomi taking over? Not necessarily. There will certainly be certain quarters where Xiaomi will possibly do well, perhaps even better than Samsung, possibly in quarter twos. But generally speaking, given the fact that Samsung is a strong global player with strong supply chain, with products in most price bands, extremely cheap to higher price bands than Apple's, that will definitely ensure Samsung being able to continue doing well.
I see. And just to go back again, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about these production issues regarding Samsung production difficulty in Vietnam and now some of these Chinese OEMs showing some more strength because of the manufacturing in China. So, and anything you have to add there in terms of the dynamics that we're seeing? Are OEMs kind of shifting things around in terms of their production?
Samsung has had a difficult production issues because earlier it had difficulties in its Texas fab factory. That happened earlier in this year. And again, later, we saw the lockdown in Vietnam. Plus, again, we are seeing certain difficulties back in Vietnam. So Samsung definitely has been facing a lot of issues from that point of view. And we'll have to see how it manages that in the slightly longer term, where it prioritizes the manufacture of certain higher end products. For example, it has been trying to prioritize certain products from its Korea factory. So we'll have to see how that turns around for Samsung and the Chinese OEMs I mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. We've seen some of that happen actually in the US market as well.
In fact, I was also slightly curious. US is such an important market, but it's also a very consolidated market with Apple and Samsung dominating quite completely. But we've recently seen the exit of LG, which has created possibly certain opportunities for other OEMs such as Motorola, HMD. Then we also see the entry of OnePlus among the top players in the US. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I can add some color to that. So, just in terms of like the overall smartphone market, I think for those that don't know, the US market is pretty heavily dominated by Apple and Samsung, making up 70-80% market share in a lot of quarters. The rest of that market share that's left over is really divided up between, historically in the past, Motorola, LG, OnePlus, Alcatel, Nokia, and some other brands. Now, if we want to dissect that further, actually, the market is really broken up also in postpaid, prepaid, and unlocked sales. So postpaid sales being from bigger carriers, maybe you heard of Verizon or T-Mobile, prepaid, Cricket, Metro by T-Mobile, Boost, and then the unlocked market is essentially, the free market, it's national retail market. And what we're seeing here are very different dynamics playing out, especially because of LG's exit and also because of a company called Vinsmart, a Vietnamese manufacturer that had entered the US market with about 2 million device production for AT&T, but then also pulled out of the market quite abruptly this year. So there are a lot of dynamics happening, and because of LG's exit, now LG has historically had around, let's say, 12, 14 million smartphones in a year in terms of shipments. Now, that leaves a huge gap, but it's not where you would usually see the gap in the high end, where LG sometimes has a stronger foothold in other markets. That market is mainly just Apple and Samsung. It's postpaid, higher end. Where LG's exit is being felt is in the prepaid market. So prepaid market is usually around a $200 ASP. There was a big void that's left where LG really had some market share, 30% or so in sub $100, $100 to $200 market. And the dynamics there have shifted towards Motorola really gaining because of their Motorola G Stylus that they have, which is very similar to what LG had as the Stylo 6 device, Stylo 5 device that they've been having, which had a lot of success in the market. Now, Motorola has gained from that. But on the other side, OnePlus as well has gained. So OnePlus not only makes high-end devices in the market for the US, but also lower end. And with the N200 device, it's a 5G device that was being aggressively promoted by T-Mobile and Metro by T-Mobile as a free 5G phone for switchers. So there are a lot of changing dynamics that are happening really in this lower end market, this 20% share that's kind of being rearranged between different OEMs. And not only that, we're seeing some shifts happening in terms of the shortages that you've talked about globally. Samsung has had some issues getting in some A-series devices, the A32 5G, for example. And one other thing that I wanted to point out is that the US market, unlike other markets, also has millimeter wave 5G, which isn't really available in a lot of other places. And so Verizon's really pushing for that. So what we're seeing in that instance is Verizon's actually looking towards more OEMs to provide millimeter wave devices, especially at lower price points. So there's a recent partnership actually made with an Indian manufacturer, Dixon, for a $350 millimeter wave device, which is unusual. There are not a lot of sub 350, even sub 400 millimeter wave devices, but we're also seeing this, getting pushed by Verizon because of their emphasis on millimeter wave. That's kind of, a big, or rather a general overview of what we're seeing in terms of what the US market is in particular, and how the ranks have been changing over the past couple quarters. But I wanted to ask you now, switching regions to Europe. So I think Europe is also another very interesting region, especially because of some of the brands, or one of the brands that I mentioned, OnePlus, being in there and being quite popular. But in a sense, I think Europe also has had a lot of success in terms of the Apple 5G iPhone. And now that Huawei has fallen off the European market share, there has been an excellent opportunity, I think, for other Chinese OEMs, for example, Xiaomi, to gain some market share. And I think this is especially true for countries, if we include Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, into the whole Europe picture. Now, that being said, we have Oppo, OnePlus, Realme, who are also involved in this market. So there's a lot happening here. Can you make sense of this market for me based on what I just said?
Certainly. So the main headline from this quarter, from quarter two, from Europe was Xiaomi taking over as the number one OEM there, which it indeed did, as you mentioned, with the caveat of including Russia and CIS within Europe, as many would think it, right? But if one divides Europe into Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and divides Europe into also the Scandinavian countries and so on, one sees slightly different dynamics there. So, for example, if one excludes Russia and CIS, Samsung is still the number one OEM in Europe. And if one sees from that point of view, Europe at the top level had been quite stable, with Samsung taking the top spot in most quarters, except quarter fours when Apple would lead them. But what we had started seeing recently in Europe was, for example, in the middle of 2018, in quarter two and quarter three, and also at the beginning of 2019, the first quarter, Huawei took the number two spot, which had previously, if not by Samsung, been occupied by Apple. And so, as you said, when Huawei left the market, Huawei lost its market share there. That left a great deal of opportunity for other Chinese OEMs. And some of those OEMs that definitely did take advantage. If we see market segments, affordable and premium affordable phones. And so the affordable segment was taken over by Xiaomi, Oppo, and OnePlus, while the premium affordable was taken partly over by Samsung and Xiaomi. And so Xiaomi was a beneficiary of Huawei's exit from multiple points of view, which definitely helped it emerge as the top OEM this quarter. But if one also sees Xiaomi slightly historically, it had been a part of the top five OEMs in Europe for several quarters, but it had been earlier towards number 4, number 5, and it had recently come to number 3, which it had occupied for a significant period of time. And till as recently as quarter 1 2021. So from quarter 1 to quarter 2 2021, it jumped from number 3 to number 1. And again, one has to say the fact that Huawei left definitely helped Xiaomi, but also this particular quarter, Samsung not being able to ship as many devices as perhaps there was a demand for in Europe also helped Xiaomi. So Xiaomi definitely benefited from that point of view. You also mentioned Oppo and Oppo's sister/subsidiary OEMs such as OnePlus and Mi. They definitely benefited. So Oppo has been creating a huge amount of brand recognition in Europe, and it's difficult to miss, for example, its sponsorship of Wimbledon, Euro 2020, etc. That definitely got some eyeballs for Oppo. And Oppo definitely benefited as a result of that. And in fact, subsidiary OnePlus entered the top 5 in Europe for the first time. And OnePlus does very well with the Scandinavian countries. It also does well in Germany. Germany is one of its biggest markets for that matter. Oppo too does very well in Central Europe. It does in Germany, for example. It does well in the UK, and it's among the top players in Switzerland, in Denmark, in Belgium, some of the Germanic nations. So Oppo and OnePlus have also done very well. Realme too entered the top 5 for the first time in quarter 1 2021, and it's still among the top players in Europe. Hopefully it will also be able to benefit from being in that region for a little bit of time. So that's what mostly has been happening in Europe. And I think it's interesting how Xiaomi may try to take advantage of having risen to the top. Most likely, Samsung would have been able to come back and stay there, but it's again facing some production difficulties. So we'll see how Xiaomi takes advantage of it, if at all it is able.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that you made regarding some of that weakness that we're seeing from Samsung. And hopefully we can have a podcast on this if there are more developments on that. Now, let's look at Asia next. And, it's a big region. So hopefully let's try to focus it a little bit more and specifically look at two of the biggest markets in the world, or in Asia, really, and also in the world, China and India. Now, in China, I know that Huawei's Void has been, again, absorbed by the likes of Vivo, Oppo, and Xiaomi. And there's been a really tough fight, I think, between Oppo and Vivo for the number one spots or the top spots. As some listeners, and as you know, Honor has been actually making a comeback because it's spun out of Huawei. So, Aman, what's happening there? Can you give me some little more insights about those dynamics I just mentioned?
Yeah, sure, Morris. Well, China is like one of the biggest markets for smartphone globally. And we have witnessed a significant shift in power in China's smartphone market in the last like 4 to 5 quarters. For example, Huawei, which was the market leader until Q2 2020, which almost controlled more than 30% of the China's smartphone market, is now only contributing around 8% of the country's total smartphone shipment because of the tough sanctions from US. So this has completely changed the dynamics in the China's smartphone market, and because of which other OEMs took advantage and they tried to increase their market share. For example, Vivo now controls 24% of China's total smartphone market because of a couple of reasons. First is they have a very strong 5G portfolio across price bands. For example, their Y series and newly launched S series, which is available as low as like $200 in China. So they had a very strong hold within the 5G market in China. Second is, I think Vivo was able to maintain a very strong and very consistent supply of smartphones in China. I mean, they have prioritized China in order to cope up with the global crisis of chipset shortages. So that's, I think, the two factors which really helped Vivo to attain and reach and maintain their number one spot in China. Coming to Xiaomi, they have been really trying hard to establish their offline presence in the country. And because of which they also participate in the recent 618 shopping festival. They offer like great discounts right from their high-end Mi 11 series to their mass market series, which really helped the brand to reach their highest ever market share of around 18%. Apple comes at number four. Interestingly, Honor became the fifth biggest player in China in the last quarter. They managed to reach the market share of 9%, which is more than the market share of their parent brand, Huawei. I think, again, couple of reasons I would say. Is first is because of the Changwan series and their mid-range Play 5 series, which they launched in the last quarter. Again, Honor 50 series, which was launched in the last week of June, really helped the brand to regain their confidence and market share in the Chinese market. Another factor which I think which really helped Honor is their brand image and their R&D capabilities which they inherited from their parent brand Huawei. Because of which Honor really managed to attract Huawei's like loyal customers who did not switch to other brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo in the last 8 to 12 months. So these are like two factors which really help Honor to come back in the Chinese market. I think another important reason which I think is their Magic 3 series, which they launched recently. They are trying to compete in the premium segment with Apple's iPhone, Samsung S series, and Huawei Mate NP series. So Honor's comeback and Xiaomi's focus on offline channel is really making the Chinese smartphone market competitive, and it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, between Vivo, Oppo, and Xiaomi, who's going to lead the market in the coming quarters.
Interesting. Do you by chance know if, consumers recognize Honor as a brand of Huawei and they're rallying behind that brand a little bit now?
They do. I mean, they have a big and a respect for Huawei, so they have some loyal customers which still wants Huawei, right? And a lot of people think that Honor is still a part of Huawei. So Honor is trying to grab the eyeballs of those loyal customers of Huawei.
I see. So that'd be interesting to see, what kind of the switching behavior is for consumers if they are going from Huawei to Honor or other OEMs. Awesome. Well, let's look into India next then. So I know that in India there is a tough fight going on between Samsung and Xiaomi overall. Now, on top of this, we have Realme, who's one of the fastest growing brands, but also Vivo, who is really focusing and has a good stronghold on the offline market. Now, I also know that there are some dynamics that are rapidly changing, really, with Jio who's partnering with Google to create a new affordable Android smartphone, and that will really have an impact on the low end. I believe it's like sub $100, right, for that smartphone. So, can you also shine a little bit of light onto this market for us?
So India is another very interesting market, and again, the world's second biggest smartphone market. And we have witnessed a strong consumer demand and sales momentum after lifting of restrictions during the deadly second wave, which happened in the month of April and May in the second quarter. Xiaomi retained its number one position with around 28% market share, which was primarily driven by Redmi 9 series and Redmi Note 10 series. The brand also entered the ultra premium segment with the launch of their latest Mi 11 series. Uh, Again, Xiaomi's budget sub brand Poco, which performed really well. Also, Xiaomi managed to leverage their online sales strategies and channel better during the second wave lockdown, which happened in the month of April and May. To meet the local demand in India, Xiaomi also expanded its manufacturing base by partnering with the local EMS players in the last couple of quarters. So Xiaomi, I mean, they expect the huge demand coming up from the local Indian market. Whereas Samsung market share has been declining a lot from the last 5 to 6 quarters. It reached to around 18% in the last quarter, partially because of, again, I mean, which Harmeet talked about, the production disruptions which happened in the Vietnam factory because of the loss. Samsung also lost its market share to different Chinese brands with like online sales channel like Xiaomi and Oppo. Although they went aggressive on their online strategies in the last couple of quarters, and they try to build their portfolio across like different price bands by like Q4. Coming to Vivo, they have been the third largest player in the country since 2019. However, their market share has been declining, and that declined by over like 1% because of COVID second wave and Vivo's high exposure to the offline sales channel. I mean, they're the biggest in terms of offline sales channel market share, so which really hampered their shipment in quarter two. Realme, they managed to retain the number fourth spot. They have been quite consistent since 2018. And the brand is considered to be as one of the fastest growing brand in the Indian market because of wide range of 5G enabled smartphones across different price bands. They have been trying to increase their offline reach in order to cater to tier 2, tier 3 Indian cities. And Realme, for example, they also capture more than 22% of India's total 5G market, which is great, I think, all because of their great penetration, great product portfolio at different price level. OnePlus is also one of the fastest growing brand. This was driven by their latest OnePlus 9 series, and they are also the leader in the premium market with around 35% market share. I also believe, Morris, that India's second wave, no, they have taught brands the importance to balance out between online and offline sales channel. I mean, we witnessed, I mean, how much Xiaomi gained the market share and how much Vivo lost the market share because of their different strategies when it comes to online and offline. With Jio launching the most affordable Android smartphone in India, we will definitely witness a lot of migration happening from feature phone users to smartphone users. Jio phone, they are definitely going to capture the stagnant entry level smartphone market in India since it's going to be the most affordable 4G smartphone in the country. And another thing is Geo, they are going to bundle their different services when they launch their smartphone in a country, for example, along with other offerings from Google. So this might push other telecom players such as Airtel and Vodafone to come up with their low cost 4G smartphones as well.
So one more thing I wanted to ask you as a follow up, because I think it's really interesting. The Indian government had this whole initiative called Make in India, right? It's still ongoing, where they invited OEMs to set up manufacturing plants in India. Uh, Do you think that that helped certain OEMs gain market share over others?
Definitely. I mean, they have managed to save a lot when it comes to production costs. So, a lot of OEMs are passing those costs to consumers, which is helping the brands to gain the market share. So, it's definitely working in favor to all the OEMs.
Cool. Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to briefly touch upon two other regions, really. Now, the Southeast Asian region has been getting a lot of attention, not just for being an up and coming smartphone market in terms of consumers wanting products, but also because it's turning into production hub really for a lot of OEMs looking to expand or rather have a more diversified supply chain. And so that's one region I wanted to ask about. And the other one is the Middle East and Africa region. So there, I know that there's a big percentage of the population still has feature phones, and we're seeing companies like Techno putting in a lot of efforts there to really promote their brand. Can you kind of now, as the last question, talk me through kind of these different regions and what the competition is like?
Sure, Maurice. I can take that briefly. So, if one looks at the Southeast Asian market, yes, it has been coming up as a major manufacturing hub. But if one sees the top players within Southeast Asia, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, uh, because they're Chinese OEM, so bulk of the shipments actually still does come for the phones that are being sold within SEA from China. And the major thing that we see happening in the Southeast Asian region, and it's not very different from what has happened in other regions, especially, for example, Europe, is that Xiaomi has taken over as the number one OEM there, and which is extremely interesting. And but Xiaomi has overtaken Oppo to become the number one OEM in SEA, unlike in Europe, it took over Samsung. So Xiaomi has definitely been doing very well in multiple regions. What happened with Oppo is that it had been focusing too much on marketing, which definitely did help it in Europe, as I mentioned, and got the eyeballs because it was not really well known. So that definitely helped it there. But within SEA, where it was already a major player, the marginal benefit of added marketing effort did not yield the sort of result that it may have done in Europe. What Xiaomi did, on the other hand, was it had a very balanced approach, online versus offline focus, which helped it during the lockdown when people gravitated towards online shopping. And Xiaomi definitely benefited from there in Southeast Asia. Also, what we've seen in Middle East and Africa is that Middle East and Africa is one of the most stable regions that we've seen. And in that, Samsung has been the number one OEM for the last 33 quarters. But what we also see is, as you mentioned, Techno has been doing well. Techno is part of the Transsion Group, which also includes ITEL and Infinix, has been doing incredibly well. Its market share from the same time last year, it has risen from 20 to 32%. And if one goes back all the way into Q1 2015, it was only 8%. And the Transsion Group has been able to do this with added focus on regions that are up and coming with huge potential, with large populations such as Nigeria. And Techno is the biggest player there with over 40% of the share. So that's definitely been helping it. What one also sees is that the whole market is sort of being consolidated, and maybe Aman can speak a little more about that.
Yeah, I think top 10 brands, their market share has been increased to around 79% as to what we witnessed in the last year, where they were contributing to around 69%. So all these is happening because, I mean, smaller brands are finding it really difficult to respond to it's like price wars, which is happening between OEMs. There's a supply chain disruption which happened because of COVID-19 lockdown in the last year and again this year. And also, I mean, a lot of smaller OEMs were impacted because of the ongoing global component shortages. So it's all these three factors are really making it difficult for smaller OEMs to play in the market. So I mean, and all these shares are going up to the bigger players. So we are witnessing a lot of consolidation happening in the entire region.
Interesting stuff, guys. I think we covered quite a bit on this podcast, and hopefully, maybe we can, drill in a little bit deeper in the next ones, especially if we go into different regions, because I think there's a lot there to unpack. But for now, I think we'll call it here, and I just wanted to thank you both for joining me on this podcast again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure, Maurice. I would like to thank you again for inviting us to be a part of today's discussion.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening and tuning in. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, and Google Podcasts. We'll have this up on our website, counterpointresearch.com, under our podcast section. Feel free to give a listen there. Check out our website for anything new and interesting related to the smartphone market and beyond. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day. Take care.